In July of 2014, an aging United States Navy frigate was prepared to take its final voyage, not across the ocean, but into retirement. After decades of service, the ship was steered into a dry dock, its massive hull settling onto thick wooden blocks as the last of the water drained away. Once the gates sealed behind it, the ship became an empty shell, resting high above the concrete floor. When the pumps stopped and the echoes faded, there was only silence. A silence so total that anyone standing there could hear the hum of their own pulse. There was only one narrow ramp connecting the dock to the deck, and when the foreman walked across it that night, he didn't know he was stepping into one of the strangest mysteries ever to unfold in a naval yard. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those cases that keeps investigators awake long after the paperwork is finished. It's about a man who followed orders, did his job by the book, and still ended up face to face with something that shouldn't have been possible. Over the next few stories, we'll look at moments like that where logic breaks, where routine becomes nightmare fuel. But tonight it all starts on that ship. The foreman was a 42-year-old contractor named Daniel Pierce. He'd spent most of his adult life crawling through the steel ribs of military vessels, a man who found peace in the clang of tools and the smell of old oil. Co-workers called him methodical. He kept a notebook for every project labeled and color-coded, and took pride in never missing a safety check. At home, his wife joked that he was incapable of losing anything because every item had a precise place. He lived just outside Norfolk with his teenage son and a rescue dog named Cooper. Those who knew him said Daniel wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd worked through storms, power failures, even a fire aboard a tugboat once, and still finished the job. To him, ships weren't haunted relics, they were just metal rivets and sweat. The dock itself sat under a wide-open sky, streaked with the last light of evening. The air smelled faintly of salt and rust. Around the dry dock, floodlights threw pale cones of light across the steel walls, leaving deep shadows in the spaces between. It was quiet enough that when the workers left for the night, the echo of their footsteps lingered. This was considered a safe job. No storms, no waves, no heavy seas, just a stationary ship being stripped for parts. Nothing dangerous at all. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Daniel entered through the gangway, carrying a flashlight and a small digital camera. His supervisor had asked for a series of interior photos to plan work zones for civilian crews, starting the next morning. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of paint and metal dust. He walked from compartment to compartment, switching off his flashlight whenever he took a picture so the flash could illuminate the room. Every click of the shutter bounced off the steel corridors and came back to him like a tiny echo. He spent nearly 2 hours documenting the maze of rooms, stairwells, and control spaces. By the time he reached the engine compartment, he had taken hundreds of photographs. Back in his office later that night, Daniel uploaded the memory card and sent the images to his supervisor. He was halfway through shutting down his computer when an email arrived almost instantly. The subject line read, "Who's the guy with the axe?" At first he thought it was a joke. He clicked open the attachment, and what appeared on his monitor stopped him cold. In one of the narrow corridors, illuminated by the stark white flash of his own camera, a figure stood halfway behind a bulkhead door. The man's face was turned toward the lens. His right hand was wrapped around the handle of an axe. The timestamp showed it was one of the first photos Daniel had taken that night, meaning he'd spent the next 2 hours walking through that ship, unaware that someone else was down there with him. When security reviewed footage from the only access ramp, no one besides Daniel was seen entering or leaving. The gates had been locked, the guards accounted for, and yet somewhere inside that silent ship, the camera had captured a man who should not have been there at all. If you're the kind of person who stays up late listening to stories like this, who finds something compelling about the mysteries that law enforcement can't quite solve, then I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now, because there's something about late nights that makes these stories hit differently, isn't there? Now, before we go any further, maybe lock your door if you haven't already. Turn off the lights if you're feeling brave and just listen. Because in this quiet moment, I'm going to tell you a story that really happened. A story that will make you wonder about the darkness hiding in ordinary places. The following morning, Daniel Pierce arrived at the dock before sunrise. The ship loomed in the pale gray light, towering above the drained basin like the skeleton of some enormous creature. Its steel hull was streaked with salt and rust, a lifetime of ocean voyages etched into every plate. Workers would arrive in a few hours to begin dismantling her, but for now the dry dock was silent, except for the distant echo of seagulls. Daniel parked his truck, signed in at the guard station, and was the first to step onto the gangway. The air felt colder once he crossed onto the deck, and the hollow creak beneath his boots made him glance back at the guards, as if to reassure himself they were still there. Inside, the corridors felt different in daylight, yet the ship seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Dust motes hung motionless in the beams from his flashlight. He passed open compartments where cables dangled like veins from the ceiling, paint flaking off in wide strips. Every few feet he stopped marking areas on his clipboard. Even without power or movement, the ship still had its own rhythm. The distant click of metal cooling, the faint groan of the hull, adjusting to dry air. These were ordinary sounds to him, but each echo seemed to carry too far, bouncing back from somewhere it shouldn't. Daniel reached the control room and paused. The ship's logbooks, stripped of their pages, lay stacked neatly on a table, ready for disposal. A few personal effects remained: a rusted coffee mug, an old clipboard with a name half erased by moisture, a tangle of frayed rope. He took a picture for record keeping, then turned toward the narrow stairwell leading below deck. His flashlight beam caught the faint outline of a footprint in the dust ahead of him. It was larger than his boot. He crouched, brushing it lightly, and realized the impression was fresh edges, crisp, undisturbed. But this didn't make sense. The military inspection team had left hours before he'd arrived, and security had confirmed the dock was sealed overnight. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come aboard early, a guard checking locks, or a stray worker from another project. But when he called out, his voice rolled through the ship unanswered, swallowed by the corridors. He stood still, listening, no footsteps, no response, just the dull hum of air moving through the vents. After a long moment he exhaled, wrote possible footprint, unknown origin in his notes, and kept going. Further down, the compartments grew tighter. The smell of oil and iron was stronger here, mingled with something damp and metallic. He told himself it was just rust and stagnant air, nothing more. He had done this kind of survey countless times. Ships, even abandoned ones, always felt alive. The steel seemed to remember everyone who had walked through it. But as he descended another flight of stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silence behind him was listening too. When he reached the lowest deck, his flashlight began to flicker. He tapped it against his palm, and the beam steadied again. Ahead, the corridor stretched into perfect darkness, pipes running along the ceiling like the ribs of some enormous creature. He snapped a photo, the flash cutting through the black, freezing a second of white light before plunging everything back into shadow. For a moment, his eyes played tricks on him. He thought he saw something shift at the edge of the light, a blur that vanished before he could focus. He blinked hard, convincing himself it was the echo of the flash burning into his retinas. He took another step, steadied his breathing, and resumed photographing. Every click of the camera felt louder now, ricocheting through the hull like a distant hammer strike. He told himself to finish quickly and get back topside, but part of him couldn't resist looking over his shoulder after every photo, half expecting to see someone or something standing there watching. Daniel paused at the intersection of two narrow corridors deep inside the ship. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of old fuel and iron. His flashlight beam wavered across the walls, catching the faint shimmer of condensation beating on steel. He thought he heard something far away, a hollow clang like a chain shifting, but when he stopped walking, the sound vanished. He tried to tell himself it was the metal contracting in the dry air, nothing unusual, yet every instinct urged him to move faster. He continued down the corridor, the beam of his flashlight cutting a thin tunnel of light ahead. Each step sent echoes bouncing off bulkheads, colliding with his own heartbeat. The deeper he went, the more the ship seemed to swallow sound. Even the click of his camera, once crisp and sharp, now sounded muffled, distant, as if he were inside something that didn't want him there. He reached a section where the floor angled slightly downward into the maintenance level, an area that hadn't been entered since decommissioning began. Dust covered everything, no footprints, no signs of recent work. He stopped to take another picture. The flash burst in the dark, illuminating the hallway for a fraction of a second. The white light burned across his vision, revealing rows of valves and a rusted sign half hanging from a pipe that read, "Restricted." When the light vanished, the world felt darker than before. He blinked hard, steadying his breathing, then took another photo. Click, flash, darkness. He moved a few steps forward, snapping as he went, each burst of light carving a momentary image into his mind, a set of stairs, an open hatch, an empty corridor. And then in one flash the beam reflected off something curved, something that caught the light just long enough for his brain to register the outline of a human shoulder. He froze. The echo of the camera shutter rolled away through the hull. The flashlight shook slightly in his hand. He aimed it toward where he thought he'd seen movement, but the beam revealed only pipes and machinery. He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the layer of grit on the floor. Nothing moved. The silence returned thicker than before, pressing in on him. He raised his camera again, telling himself he'd imagined it, that it was just a trick of the flash reflecting off metal. He pressed the shutter. The flash erupted, and this time he saw it clearly, something pale at the end of the corridor, the shape of a face turned toward him. It was gone before the sound of the shutter faded. Daniel stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. He switched on his flashlight, sweeping it wildly across the hallway. Empty. The doorways were all sealed, the shadows motionless. For a long moment he just stood there, his pulse pounding in his ears. He whispered to himself, "No one's here," as though saying it aloud would make it true. He took another step, angling the light down the corridor again, searching for the reflection that had startled him. When nothing appeared, he exhaled slowly and tried to focus on finishing the job. He wanted to laugh it off, to chalk it up to exhaustion or imagination, but something deep inside him refused to let go of the thought that he wasn't alone. He snapped one last photo, the flash bursting like lightning, and somewhere beyond its brief light, he thought he heard the faint scrape of metal against metal, as though someone were dragging something heavy just out of sight. By the time Daniel returned to his office, the sky outside the dockyard was beginning to fade from gray to amber. The day had gone by in a blur of routine log entries, inspection reports, a quick call with the safety officer. He was tired but satisfied that the preliminary survey was finished ahead of schedule. The ship, silent and still in its basin, seemed far less menacing under daylight. He didn't mention the strange reflections or the footprint in his notes when he filed the report. He told himself it was pointless to bring up something he couldn't prove. That evening, while the dock workers cleared out, Daniel stayed late, reviewing photographs for quality before sending them off. Hundreds of shots filled the screen, corridors, stairwells, control rooms, all empty and colorless. He checked for clarity, deleted duplicates, and uploaded the rest to a shared folder. It was tedious work, but comforting in its normalcy. Around 8:30, he sent the final batch and packed up his things. He had just reached the door when his computer chimed. New message. The subject line read simply, "Who's the guy with the axe?" He stared at it, unsure what to think. The sender was his supervisor, Mark Dalton, who rarely used humor in emails. Daniel clicked it open. Inside was one of his own photographs, time-stamped from early in the shoot. It showed a corridor he remembered clearly, the same one where he'd seen that strange reflection. But there, halfway hidden behind a bulkhead, was a man. The flash had frozen him mid-step, one shoulder turned to hand, gripping the handle of an axe that gleamed silver in the camera light. The man's face was partially obscured, but what Daniel could see looked pale, expressionless, and wrong. For several seconds, he just sat there, staring at the image, waiting for his brain to offer a logical explanation. Maybe a trick of light, maybe an artifact from the flash. But as he zoomed in, the details only sharpened. The folds of a dark jumpsuit, the line of shadow beneath the axe blade, a faint blur at the edges, as if he'd been moving when the picture was taken. Daniel felt the back of his neck tighten. He had been in that hallway less than 2 minutes after that photo. He replied quickly, "There was nobody there. I was alone." Mark responded within moments. "Then how do you explain this? Check the time code. It's from the first 10 minutes. Daniel pushed his chair back, heartbeat quickening. He checked the folder timestamps. The image had been taken at 9:14 p.m., barely 20 minutes after he'd boarded. He remembered that section vividly. He'd stopped, taken 2 shots, moved on. There had been no sound, no movement, nothing, yet the figure was there, clear as day. He switched back to the surveillance camera feed from the dry dock, which he could access remotely. The angle showed the gangway, the only way on or off the ship. He scrubbed through the footage from the moment he entered until the moment he left. No one else appeared. No silhouettes crossing the ramp. No shadows moving behind him. The gates had been closed the entire time. A sick, crawling feeling settled in his stomach. He checked the file metadata again, as if numbers could lie. They didn't. Every image matched the sequence perfectly. Somewhere inside that sealed ship, when he was completely alone, his camera had captured a man holding an axe. Daniel sat back in his chair, the glow from the monitor washing his face pale. He reached for his phone to call security, then stopped. What would he even say? That his camera had photographed a ghost, a trespasser who left no trace. He saved the image to his desktop, shut off the computer, and locked his office door before heading for the parking lot. Behind him, the dry dock stood motionless under the floodlights, the ship's shadow stretching long and sharp across the concrete. The next morning, Daniel barely slept. The image of the figure haunted him each time he closed his eyes. At sunrise, he drove back to the dock, hoping that seeing the ship in broad daylight would make the whole thing seem less impossible. The dry dock looked the same as always. Massive gates shut tight, the frigate resting on its wooden supports, floodlights still glowing from the overnight shift. He found Mark near the security shack, holding a cup of coffee, and that same uneasy expression Daniel had seen in his email. Mark didn't waste time. You were the only one aboard, he said, tapping a printout of the photo. We double-checked the sign-in logs. No one else entered. Together they walked up the gangway. Every few feet the steel grated under their boots. The sound echoed in long metallic notes that faded into the hollow belly of the ship. The morning light streaming through the open hatchways made the corridors look narrower, the walls closing in. Daniel led Mark to the hallway from the photo, pointing out the angle where he had been standing. They replayed the moment over and over, comparing the perspective to the still image. Everything matched perfectly, except for the figure. Mark frowned. Could be someone hiding when you went through. Daniel shook his head. There's nowhere to hide. Look, every hatch was sealed. You'd hear them. They searched the entire lower deck, opening maintenance rooms, storage lockers, and crawl spaces. Dust lay undisturbed. No footprints besides Daniel's from the day before. Nothing out of place. At the far end of the corridor, a heavy service door stood chained shut. The inspection tag on the lock was intact, dated a week earlier. It hadn't been touched. Back outside, Mark requested the overnight security footage. The camera covering the gangway was positioned at a downward angle, clearly capturing anyone entering or leaving the ship. From the time Daniel boarded to the time he left, the ramp remained empty. The guards had logged no motion, no alarms, no unusual activity. They even pulled the backup recording from the gatehouse camera, overlooking the entire dock basin. Still nothing. By early afternoon, the small investigation turned into a full review. 2 Navy contractors inspected the perimeter fencing. Another officer verified the floodgate locks. Everything was secure. No gaps, no alternate entry points. A senior engineer explained that with the dry dock drained, any attempt to climb down into the basin would leave clear scuff marks on the steel walls, and there were none. The more they verified, the less sense it made. Every test confirmed the same conclusion: there was no physical way for anyone to enter or leave the ship without using the gangway. And yet the photograph existed, time-stamped, verified, showing a man holding an axe in a space that had been sealed. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his truck, overlooking the dock. The ship stood silent below its hull, catching the last light of dusk. Workers had started arriving again, unaware of what had been found. He wanted to tell them, to warn them, but the words felt absurd. How do you warn someone about something you can't explain? He turned the photo over in his hands. The printed image was grainy, but the details still unnerved him. The angle of the figure's head, the way one eye seemed to catch the flash directly, glinting like a reflection from something not quite human. He folded the photo and tucked it into his glove compartment, telling himself he'd delete the digital file tomorrow. Maybe then he could forget. But as he looked out at the dock one last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ship wasn't done with him yet. Within a week, the photo had circulated quietly among the dock employees. No one discussed it openly, but word spread in whispers. Someone had been on the frigate after hours, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. A few of the younger workers started making excuses to avoid night shifts, claiming family obligations or sudden illness. Others dismissed it as a trick of light, a ghost story for bored crews. But when Daniel passed them on his morning rounds, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Everyone knew he was the one who'd taken the picture. Mark tried to keep things professional. He ordered another inspection of the ship, this time during daylight, and with 3 people recording video as they moved from deck to deck. Nothing appeared out of place. The hallways were empty, the machinery stripped the air still. But when they reviewed the footage later, one of the technicians noticed something strange. At the exact timestamp that matched Daniel's original photograph, A faint sound cut through the static of the camera microphone, two dull metallic taps evenly spaced like footsteps on steel. It was enough to make the supervisors call for a brief suspension of work until the ship could be cleared again. Security spent the next 2 days running thermal sweeps and motion sensors through the compartments. They found no heat signatures, no signs of life. The report they issued afterward read like a checklist of denials: no intruder detected, no evidence of tampering, no explanation found. Daniel didn't go back on board. He handed his badge to the guard and said he needed time off. That night he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the printed photograph under a desk lamp. The light washed out most of the detail, but the figure's outline remained unmistakable. The axe handle angled across the chest, the empty corridor behind him. Daniel wondered how close he had been when that picture was taken. How many seconds separated him from the moment that flash froze whatever was standing there. He thought about deleting every copy, pretending it had never happened. But instead, he slid the photo into an envelope and tucked it into the back of his notebook, the same one he used to document safety violations and maintenance notes. On the front page beneath the date, he wrote a single line: "There was no way on or off that ship." A month later, the frigate was fully dismantled. Steel sections were cut, numbered, and shipped off to different yards. The hull that had held its secret was gone. Yet, even after the basin was cleared and refilled, the night guards swore they sometimes heard faint metallic echoes coming from the direction of the dock, long after everything had been removed. When asked, Daniel said nothing. He'd already decided never to work another dry dock job again. For him, the strangest part wasn't the figure itself. It was the idea that something could exist in a space so completely sealed, something that could be there without leaving a single trace. Because if it could happen once, it could happen anywhere. And the truth is, sometimes the places that seem safest, the ones locked, secured, and guarded, are the very ones that keep their secrets best. That case left investigators questioning what it really means for a place to be secure. But if you thought a sealed ship was impossible to breach, what happened 2 years later, inside a quiet apartment in Chicago, would prove that danger doesn't always need a key. In July of 2016, 28-year-old Jordan Baranskis woke up to the soft hum of the television. She'd fallen asleep on the couch again. The early morning light leaked in through the blinds, washing the room in gray. Her boyfriend Matt was still asleep at the other end of the sectional, one arm dangling over the edge, snoring softly. For a moment, everything felt completely normal. The smell of coffee grounds from the night before, the faint static buzz of the muted TV, the small comfort of routine. She stretched, careful not to wake him, and padded upstairs to start getting ready for work. Her purse wasn't on the bed where she'd left it. That wasn't unusual at first. She misplaced things all the time. She checked the nightstand, the dresser, the bathroom counter, nothing. A few minutes later, her frustration began to rise. She searched the spare room, the laundry basket, even inside the closet. The purse was nowhere. She was certain she'd had it the night before. She remembered rifling through it to grab chapstick before settling in to watch a movie with Matt. 15 minutes later, she was tearing through the upstairs rooms, glancing at the clock and feeling panic crawl up her spine. Downstairs, Matt stirred as Jordan shook his shoulder. "Can you help me look? My purse is gone." He grumbled, half awake. "Maybe you left it at the restaurant." "No," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know I had it last night." The small argument that followed was one every couple has had, one person insisting, the other skeptical, both too tired to be patient. Matt wanted her to call the restaurant and check. Jordan wanted him to stand up and look. Voices rose not out of anger but out of stress. She was late for work, and he didn't see the point in tearing the house apart for something he was convinced wasn't there. Then Jordan remembered the Nest camera. They'd installed it a few months earlier to check on their 2 dogs whenever they were out. It pointed toward the living room and front door, and it recorded automatically any time motion was detected. If her purse had made it home last night, the footage would prove it. She opened the app, scrubbing through the timeline until she found them returning from dinner. On the screen, she saw herself walk through the door, purse hanging from her shoulder. She smirked at Matt. "Told you." He leaned over her shoulder to watch. The timestamp showed them coming home just before midnight. Jordan set the purse on the arm of the couch, turned off the lights, and both of them collapsed onto the cushions. The feed went still. She was about to close the app when she noticed a small marker on the timeline motion detected 3:30 a.m. "Wait," she said quietly, scrolling to it. The feed jumped to the middle of the night. The living room was dark, lit only by the faint blue glow of the television screen. At first, nothing seemed to move. Then, at the top of the stairs, a shape appeared, tall, thin-hooded. The figure stood there perfectly still, looking down at them. Jordan's hand froze on the phone. The hooded figure didn't move for nearly 20 seconds, only watching. Then it descended the stairs with deliberate, slow steps and disappeared out of frame. The next frame showed nothing but silence and the steady light from the TV. Jordan's purse was gone. At first, Jordan and Matt didn't say anything. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the dogs shifting on the rug. The clip kept looping silently, showing the same dark figure on the stairs, the same slow descent, and then nothing. Jordan replayed it a second time, then a third, searching for something, any detail that made sense. "Maybe it's a glitch," she said, her voice trembling, but trying to sound rational. "Maybe the camera picked up a shadow." Matt leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "A shadow doesn't walk." They watched it again. When the figure moved, the pixels bent just enough to prove it wasn't compression, noise, or bad lighting. It was a person. Someone had been standing in their house while they slept. Jordan felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She looked around the living room, as though expecting to find the figure still there, hiding behind the furniture. She handed the phone to Matt, unable to keep holding it. He rewound to before the motion marker, scanning every second. The staircase was empty, the shadows steady, until 3:30 exactly. Then, from the hallway at the top, the hooded figure emerged again. Its movements were deliberate, slow enough that each step looked practiced. At one point, it turned slightly toward the camera, and though its face was in shadow, the posture was unmistakably human. Matt muted the TV. "We would have heard someone," he whispered. Jordan shook her head. The dogs didn't even bark. They checked the front and back doors, both locked from the inside, windows latched. There was no sign of forced entry. Matt's confusion shifted into irritation, an instinctive defense against fear. "Maybe it's old footage, like it overrode itself wrong," he said, scrolling back through older recordings. But every clip before that night looked normal. Walks with the dogs, cooking dinner, falling asleep, watching movies. Then the gap. And then the figure. The longer they stared, the more wrong it felt. The figure's presence wasn't chaotic or hurried. It didn't rummage through drawers or rush out the door. It just watched. The way it stood on the stairs facing the couch suggested intent, like it had been there before. Jordan couldn't stop replaying the image in her mind, its stillness, the shape of the hood, how easily it blended into the dark. She turned on every light in the house, the brightness, a small defense against the realization that their home had already been invaded. They called the police, who arrived 20 minutes later. Two officers stood in the living room while Matt replayed the footage on his phone. Both stared without speaking until one finally asked, "You're sure this wasn't a friend playing a prank?" Jordan shook her head. "We were both asleep right there. You can see us." The officers filed a report, checked the locks, and told them they'd forward the footage to the department's digital evidence unit. But before leaving, one of them said quietly, "You might want to stay somewhere else tonight." Neither of them did. They couldn't bring themselves to leave the dogs behind, and besides, it was daylight by then. The city noises outside were comforting. But as the day stretched on, Jordan found herself glancing up the stairs again and again, half expecting to see the hooded figure return, frozen mid-step at the landing, watching. That night, neither of them could sleep. The police had left hours earlier, but the house felt different now, hollow in a way that light couldn't fix. Jordan sat cross-legged on the couch, the phone still in her hand, the Nest app open to that same frozen frame. Matt paced the living room, restless energy pouring out of him in short, sharp movements. Every creak of the floor made them both look toward the stairs. "I want to see it again," Jordan finally said. Matt hesitated, but curiosity won. He sat beside her, the two of them leaning close as the video started from the beginning. The timestamp read 3:2:9:47 a.m. The room looked still, the television glow flickering against their sleeping faces. Then at 3:30:01, a faint movement appeared at the top of the stairs, something darker than the surrounding shadows. The figure stepped forward, slowly emerging into view. It wasn't the shape of a thief creeping for valuables. Its body language was wrong, too deliberate, too steady. The hood obscured its face entirely. The footage had no sound, but both swore they could feel the weight of its presence, the silence that filled the room, while it just stood there watching them sleep. At 3:30:20, it took one step down. The camera's night vision sharpened the hood, catching a faint glint from the television light. Another step, then another. Jordan's pulse raced as the figure reached the halfway point of the stairs and paused again, one hand resting on the railing. For nearly 15 seconds it didn't move. At 3:30:43, it turned its head toward the camera. The motion detection icon blinked red in the corner of the screen. For the first time, they saw what looked like eyes, flat, unreflective, impossible to read. Then, as if aware it had been seen, the figure descended the last few steps and drifted out of frame. Jordan scrubbed forward, frame by frame. The next motion marker came at 3:31:17. The figure passed through the living room, moving toward the front door. It never once looked at the sleeping couple on the couch. The door never opened, never closed. There was no sign of it leaving. The rest of the night played normally. At 7:12 a.m., Jordan stirred awake, turned off the television, and went upstairs. Matt rewound again, slower this time. "There's no sound of a door," he said quietly. "There's no sound of anything," Jordan whispered. They checked the entryway again, touching the deadbolt, testing the chain, confirming it had been locked all night. They went to the back door, then the windows. Everything sealed from the inside. Matt opened a new video clip on the app the following morning when Jordan had gone upstairs looking for her purse. The dogs were awake, then tails wagging lazily. No barking, no alarm. Jordan's purse, which had been visible on the arm of the couch in earlier footage, was gone. He sat back, unable to process it. "It's like it knew exactly where to go," he said. Jordan didn't answer. She was staring at the dark reflection of the stairs on the television screen. In the faint glow, the banister looked almost like a silhouette frozen mid-motion, the same spot where that hooded figure had paused to watch them. She shut off the TV. The room went still again, perfectly quiet, as though holding its breath. Two detectives returned the next morning to collect the footage. They were polite but skeptical, the kind of professionals who had seen every version of fear a homeowner could present. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, asked the same questions. 3 different ways had anyone else stayed over. Was there a spare key? Did they ever forget to lock the door? Jordan answered each one carefully. No, and never. They copied the nest recordings onto a flash drive and promised to review them at the precinct. For evidence purposes, they took photos of the front door, the windows, the stairwell, and the living room. Nothing was broken or disturbed. The only item missing was Jordan's purse. Inside it had been her wallet, car keys, and a small silver locket her grandmother had given her. The officers dusted for prints on the doorknobs and window frames, but found nothing usable, no smudges, no partials, nothing that didn't belong to the couple. After they left, Jordan and Matt stood in the middle of their living room, trying to decide whether they felt safer or worse. The intrusion didn't look like a burglary. The figure hadn't rushed or searched. It had just watched, then vanished. The lock still clicked shut. The air still smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent. Everything looked the same, yet nothing did. 2 days later, one of the detectives called to follow up. "We can't confirm how the suspect entered or left," she said. "There's no evidence of forced entry or tampering with the doors. The footage doesn't show a clear face. We're still analyzing the frame rate for inconsistencies, but so far it looks genuine." Jordan asked if they thought it could have been a hacker manipulating the camera feed, something digital instead of physical. The detective hesitated. "It's possible, but that wouldn't explain your missing purse." Matt took the phone next, frustration edging his voice. "So what are we supposed to do? Just wait for it to happen again?" The detective sighed. "Change your locks. Maybe install a secondary camera facing the staircase. If we get any new leads, we'll contact you." After the call ended, Matt ordered another camera that arrived 2 days later. He mounted it in the hallway upstairs, facing the top of the stairs where the figure had first appeared. Jordan couldn't bring herself to sleep on the couch anymore. For the first few nights, she slept with the bedroom light on the phone on her nightstand, open to the live camera feed. The footage stayed quiet. No movement, no motion alerts, no more shadows descending the stairs. Weeks passed, then months. They changed the locks, replaced the alarm system, and told themselves that whoever or whatever it was wouldn't come back. Eventually, they stopped checking the app every night. But every once in a while, when the house settled and the woods shifted in the dark, Jordan would imagine the sound of a slow, deliberate footstep on the stairs, and she'd glance toward the screen just to make sure the red motion icon wasn't blinking again. The footage didn't stay private for long. A week after the police took the copy, an edited version surfaced online. Someone inside the department had leaked it, trimming the video to the few seconds when the hooded figure appeared on the stairs. Within 24 hours, it had millions of views. Comment sections filled with arguments, some claiming it was staged, others calling it proof of something supernatural. The title that stuck came from a thread on Reddit, "The Creeper Ghost." Reporters began calling Jordan and Matt's apartment complex, asking for interviews. They declined every request, but news vans still parked outside for several days. Matt stopped answering the phone altogether. Jordan deleted her social media accounts after strangers began messaging her theories about demonic energy camera loops, even government surveillance experiments. A few called her a liar. One man sent her a long email, explaining how he had seen the same figure in his own house and wanted to compare footage. She never replied. The police didn't have much more to offer. They interviewed maintenance workers, neighbors, and even a delivery driver who'd been on their street that night. No one had seen anyone in a hood or acting suspiciously. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. The doors had been locked from the inside. The case file grew thicker but not clearer. Every possible theory contradicted the evidence. At one point, a freelance tech blogger claimed to have traced the figure's outline frame by frame, suggesting that it was simply a friend of Matt's entering quietly through the front door before the footage was corrupted. The police checked. The timestamp didn't line up, and the blogger's friend theory collapsed within days. Another rumor claimed it was part of a viral marketing campaign for a horror film. That too was disproven when the production studio denied any involvement. The strangest moment came 2 months later when a second video appeared online. This one showed a completely different apartment, another couple asleep on a couch, and another hooded figure standing on the stairs. The clip was grainy, anonymous, and possibly fake, but the resemblance was uncanny. The internet erupted again, reviving the creeper ghost story. The police, overwhelmed with false tips, issued a brief statement, no connection verified. Investigation ongoing. Inside their apartment, Jordan and Matt had long since removed both Nest cameras. The holes in the wall where the mounts had been were still visible, small reminders that technology hadn't made them safer. Nights were quiet, but Jordan had stopped sleeping deeply. Every sound made her open her eyes, waiting for a shape at the top of the stairs. Matt stopped watching television after dark. Even with new locks, motion lights, and alarms, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had already learned their patterns. Over time, people forgot. The online frenzy moved on to new mysteries, new footage, new speculation. But for Jordan, the image never faded. Whenever she closed her eyes, she could still see the hooded figure standing there, motionless, one step higher than the last time. She blinked, as though it hadn't left, but had only been waiting for her to look away again. Months later, the case file on Jordan and Matt's break-in was quietly closed. Officially, it remained unsolved. The report listed it as burglary, no suspect identified, even though nothing about it fit the pattern of a burglary. The missing purse was written off as item of opportunity, and the Nest footage was filed as unverified anomaly. For the detectives, it was another strange case among thousands. For Jordan, it never stopped replaying. The couple moved out of that apartment the following spring. The landlord never filled the unit again, at least not right away. Prospective tenants would come for tours, but the moment they saw the long staircase beside the living room, they'd hesitate. The listing stayed online for nearly a year before disappearing entirely. Matt said the move was supposed to be a fresh start. New city, new routine, no memories of what had happened. But Jordan noticed the locks first thing in every new place they lived. She memorized how each door sounded when it shut, how each hinge creaked. It became a habit she couldn't unlearn. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night and reach for her phone, half expecting to see a red motion marker glowing at the bottom of the screen. The police never recovered her purse. Credit cards went unused, and her ID was never found. A detective eventually called to say the department had exhausted every lead. Before hanging up, he added quietly, "Whoever it was knew what they were doing." Years later, when journalists revisited unsolved viral mysteries from the early 2000s, the Creeper Ghost video made the list. A small note at the end of the article mentioned the couple by name, describing them as reluctant participants in one of the internet's earliest digital legends. The writer pointed out that the case blurred the line between crime and folklore, between fear that can be solved and fear that simply becomes part of the culture. Jordan never read the article. She didn't need to. Every time she thought about that night, she remembered the way the figure had stood on the stairs, not moving, not threatening, just existing where it shouldn't. It had broken the simplest rule of safety, that home was the one place the outside world couldn't reach. And that knowledge, more than any missing purse or unanswered question, was the part that never went away. Because sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't what someone did. It's the silence that comes after, when you realize the world is still going on, as if nothing happened, and you're the only one who knows it did. If the creeper ghost proved that fear could slip into our homes unnoticed, the next story would show what happens when fear moves inside the mind. In the fall of 1974, in a quiet English town called Ossett, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was known for his easy smile. Neighbors said you could hear him laughing through open windows, telling jokes while fixing something in his garden or helping a friend patch a fence. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Christine, and a playful father to their 5 children. The Taylors were the kind of family people pointed to as an example of stability, a warm home, steady routine, nothing to hide. Then, almost overnight, that laughter stopped. It began with a minor accident. Michael fell from a ladder while repairing the roof of his shed. The injury itself wasn't serious, but something about it changed him. The pain never quite went away, and within weeks he was short-tempered, withdrawn, no longer joking with neighbors or playing with his kids. Christine told friends it was like living with a stranger. The Taylors weren't religious, though most of their town was. Ossett was the kind of place where Sunday mornings meant bells, hymns, and every shop closed until noon. So when one of Michael's friends suggested that faith might help him recover his old self, Christine encouraged it. Anything was worth trying. The friend told him about a small group called the Christian Fellowship, a prayer circle led by a 21-year-old woman named Marie Robinson. She was lively, warm, and had a way of making every member feel seen. Michael agreed to attend, thinking it might at least give him something positive to focus on. The first night he went, he came home smiling for the first time in months. He told Christine the pain in his back had faded while they prayed. He said Marie had looked right at him during the service and told him God had chosen him for something special. From that night forward, Michael couldn't stay away. He attended every meeting, sometimes twice a week, helping clean the church afterward or walking Marie to her car. Christine noticed the shift immediately. He spoke less to her and more about Marie, how kind she was, how she seemed to understand him better than anyone. The warmth that used to belong to their home now seemed to orbit this new group. Rumors began to spread. People whispered that Michael and Marie were spending time together alone after services. At first, Christine ignored it, but when neighbors started asking if everything was all right between them, she decided to see for herself. On the 1st of October, she waited until Michael left for the evening meeting, then followed him to the small brick church on the edge of town. The front doors were still unlocked. Inside, she could hear voices rising in prayer from a back room. When she walked in, the prayers stopped. 20 sets of eyes turned toward her. Michael was standing near the center of the circle, his back to her. Christine pointed a trembling finger and said, "I know you're having an affair with her. Admit it." Michael didn't look at her. He looked at Marie. And that's when everyone in the room saw the change. His face twisted into something wild, something not human. The man who used to laugh louder than anyone in Ossett opened his mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't laughter at all. The moment Christine confronted him in that church, something inside Michael seemed to snap. Witnesses would later describe it as if two people were fighting over the same body. He began shouting in broken fragments, words that didn't sound like English, voice rising and falling in pitch until it turned into a kind of animal noise. Marie backed away terrified, and several members of the group rushed forward to hold him down. Even with 10 people gripping his arms and legs, Michael thrashed with unnatural strength, eyes wide-mouthed, foaming as he shouted sounds no one could interpret. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. His body went limp, his face went slack, and for a few seconds he looked confused as though waking from a dream. When he realized where he was, he started sobbing. He told the group he didn't remember anything that had just happened. After that night, the fellowship's meetings changed. Marie insisted they pray specifically for Michael's deliverance. She believed a dark spirit had attached itself to him, something drawn out by his guilt and despair. The others agreed, though not everyone understood what that meant. In small towns like Osset, faith often blended with folklore, and words like possession were used cautiously. But when Michael returned to church the next week, the atmosphere shifted again. He prayed louder than anyone, sometimes shouting over Marie's words. He laughed when others cried and cried when others laughed. He stopped sleeping. Neighbors said they saw him pacing the street outside his home long after midnight, muttering to himself. Christine tried to talk to him, but his responses were scattered, sometimes affectionate, sometimes cruel. One night, he told her she wasn't really his wife, that she was a copy sent to deceive him. Another night, he stayed up, carving crosses into small pieces of wood, arranging them in a circle on the kitchen floor before dawn. Marie visited once, hoping to calm him, but the encounter only made things worse. Michael clung to her hands and begged her to pray harder, saying he could feel something crawling beneath his skin, whispering through his teeth. Marie left the house shaken, convinced that whatever was happening wasn't medical or emotional, it was spiritual. Word spread through the church quickly. The priest was called. When he arrived to speak with Michael, the man was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by pages from the Bible he had torn out and laid flat in a perfect circle. He told the priest he could see faces forming in the paper. That evening, Christine wrote in her diary that she no longer recognized the man she had married. The warmth, the humor, even the sadness, everything human about him seemed to have been replaced by something hollow and watchful. And every time she saw him whispering to himself in an empty room, she felt less like a wife and more like a witness. The next meeting took place 3 nights later, inside the same church, where Christine had confronted her husband. The air was close thick, with the smell of candle wax and old carpet. Marie sat in the center of the circle, Bible open, her voice trembling as she led the group in prayer. Michael was there too, seated beside her, eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't spoken since entering. Christine waited outside until the prayers began, then pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "Tell them the truth, Michael. Tell them what you've been doing with her." The entire room froze. Michael didn't look up. He just muttered something too soft to hear. Marie tried to calm Christine, saying it was a misunderstanding, but the accusation hung in the air like static. When Christine demanded an answer again, Michael suddenly lifted his head. Witnesses later said it was like watching a mask fall away. His face contorted, the veins in his neck standing out as he began to scream, not words, not even sounds, but a guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the walls. He lurched toward Marie, hands outstretched. The others reacted instantly, chairs clattering as they grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms. Even with half the group holding him down, he fought like an animal. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed. Then just as quickly he went still, Silence filled the room. Marie knelt beside him, whispering prayers through shaking lips. Everyone watched, afraid to move. Michael opened his eyes again, calm, smiling faintly, as though waking from a pleasant dream. His voice came out soft and unfamiliar. "It's gone," he said. "It's gone now." No one knew what to do. Christine began crying, her anger replaced by terror. Marie placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, but he flinched, pulling away. "It's still in the room," he whispered. He began speaking in short broken bursts, alternating between gibberish and fragments of scripture. Marie tried to follow along, flipping through her Bible for matching verses, but the words didn't make sense together. It was like listening to two people talking at once through the same mouth. Then his tone changed again, low, mocking, cruel. He stared at Marie and began repeating her own prayers, back to her in perfect rhythm, voice deepening until the words distorted into growls. The others tried to continue praying, but the sound of Michael's voice drowned them out. He was laughing now, a sharp, joyless sound that echoed against the stone walls. When Marie shouted his name, he stopped mid-laugh and whispered, "You can't save him." A cold stillness fell over the room. The group's leader, an older man named Raymond, ordered everyone to stand back. He told them not to touch Michael, not to speak to him, to just keep praying. After several minutes, Michael collapsed forward, landing hard on the floor. When they rolled him over, he was unconscious, breathing heavily but alive. He didn't remember any of it later. He told Christine that all he saw were flashes of light and faces hovering over him. The church members said it was the moment they realized something evil had taken hold of him. Marie called the Anglican clergy that same night. She said she was afraid the spirit inside Michael wasn't finished, and that whatever it was, it already knew her name. The church contacted the Anglican clergy the next morning. 2 priests were dispatched from a nearby parish, Father Peter Vincent, an experienced exorcist, and Reverend Raymond Smith, his assistant. They arrived in Ossett carrying a worn leather case of holy oil, crucifixes, and a small silver vial of water blessed in York. Both men had conducted deliverances before, but nothing could have prepared them for Michael Taylor. By the time they reached the small fellowship chapel, dusk had fallen. The congregation was waiting, 20 people gathered in uneasy silence. Michael sat in the center of the room on a wooden chair, hands bound loosely with fabric straps. His head hung low, his breathing shallow but rhythmic, almost like he was sleeping. Christine stood near the wall, pale and shaking. Father Vincent began with a simple prayer. The instant his voice filled the room, Michael's eyes snapped open. He stared at the priest unblinking and began to laugh, a low, deliberate laugh that made several members step back. The air felt heavy, charged. Raymond opened his Bible and continued reading from the book of Luke, his voice trembling. What followed lasted nearly 8 hours. At first, Michael screamed in fragmented bursts, shouting obscenities that shifted between voices, some high and mocking, others deep and guttural. He writhed in the chair, straining against the straps. When they tried to anoint his forehead with oil, he snapped forward, teeth bared, shouting words none of them could recognize. Witnesses swore it sounded like different languages overlapping. Each time the priests pressed harder in prayer, Michael's body twisted as though reacting to an invisible force. Hours passed. The candles burned low, filling the air with smoke and sweat. Christine fainted twice. Marie sat in the corner, crying, whispering the same short prayer over and over. Father Vincent alternated between prayer and command, demanding the spirits give their names. Each time he did, Michael shouted new words, 37 in total, before collapsing against the restraints, exhausted. By 4 in the morning, the priests were trembling with fatigue. Michael lay motionless, skin glistening with sweat, eyes unfocused. Father Vincent poured the last of the blessed water over his head and declared the ritual complete. 40 were here, he said quietly. 37 have gone. Marie looked up, startled. What about the rest? Father Vincent shook his head. 3 remain. We'll continue tomorrow. He's too weak tonight. They untied Michael's hands and eased him to the floor. His breathing was shallow but steady. For the first time in weeks, his expression looked peaceful. When Christine knelt beside him, he smiled faintly and whispered, "It's quieter now." The priests packed their things and left the chapel just before dawn, promising to return the next evening. Everyone else went home in silence, drained by what they'd witnessed. Only Marie stayed behind, cleaning the room in slow mechanical movements. The wax from the candles had hardened on the floor in long gray streaks. Before leaving, she turned off the last light and looked once more at the chair where Michael had sat. The fabric straps were torn nearly in half. When the priests left that morning, the streets of Osset were still dark. Michael and Christine drove home in silence. Neighbors later said they saw their car pull into the driveway around 6 a.m. The curtains in their windows stayed closed all day. By noon, the town had started its usual rhythm: school bells, delivery trucks, the sound of life resuming. No one knew that inside the Taylor house the quiet had already been broken. At 12:30, a woman who lived a few doors down heard shouting. It was brief, followed by a thud, and then nothing. She hesitated, telling herself it was probably just another argument. A few minutes later, she noticed movement outside her front window. A man was walking down the middle of the street, completely naked, his skin smeared with something dark. He was muttering about Satan. His steps were slow, almost dazed, as if he didn't know where he was. The woman called the police. When the first patrol car arrived, officers found Michael sitting on the curb near a stone wall. He was curled into himself, knees to his chest, whispering a prayer under his breath. His eyes were wide but unfocused, and he smiled when they asked if he was hurt. One of the officers placed a blanket over his shoulders and asked where his wife was. Michael pointed toward his house and said softly, "She's resting. I've set her free." Inside the house, the scene was quiet and unbearable. The air smelled of metal and dust. Every clock in the home had stopped at a different time. Christine lay on the floor of the living room. The family dog was nearby. There was no one else inside. The officers backed out immediately and called for additional units. The first responder outside began retching in the grass. Later, the police report would describe the interior only in technical terms: severe trauma consistent with sustained assault, no weapon recovered, suspect restrained without resistance. It avoided adjectives. Michael was taken to the station wrapped in a gray blanket. When questioned, he appeared calm and polite. He said he didn't remember what had happened after returning from the church. He remembered the priests, the prayers, and then waking up outside covered in blood. "It wasn't me," he told them. "It was them." When asked who them referred to, he smiled faintly and whispered the ones they missed. Word spread through Osset before evening. By nightfall, reporters from London were already calling the police for confirmation. Locals gathered near the end of the Taylor Street, speaking in hushed tones. Some blamed religion. Others said it had to be insanity. A few whispered about the devil. The following week, the church suspended all prayer meetings indefinitely. Marie Robinson left town soon after. In her statement, she said she believed the exorcism had worked, but that Michael had gone home still haunted, carrying pieces of what they had driven out. The trial began 6 months later at the Crown Court in Leeds. Reporters filled the gallery notebooks, ready, hoping to make sense of what had happened in Osset. The prosecution opened with the photographs of the church and the testimony of the priests describing the exorcism that had taken nearly 8 hours. The defense did not dispute the facts of the crime. They focused instead on what the church had done to Michael before it happened. Psychiatrists testified that Michael was suffering from severe mental illness, likely brought on by stress and religious obsession. Others argued that the rituals he endured only deepened his delusion. The priests, when questioned, stood by their account. Father Vincent said he believed evil was real and that he had done everything he could to save Michael's soul. The courtroom fell silent when the prosecutor asked if he still believed demons had been inside the defendant. There were many voices that night, Vincent said quietly, not all of them human. Christine's family sat behind the rail, listening to every word. They wanted answers, but the testimony only made the story harder to understand. Was it madness, faith, or both feeding each other until something irreversible broke? After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge ordered Michael Taylor to Broadmoor Hospital for treatment. He stayed there for 4 years before being declared recovered and released. When reporters found him decades later, living alone in a small flat near the edge of town, he refused interviews. Neighbors said he was quiet, polite, and always seemed to be listening for something. Those who remembered the case wondered how a man who had once been the center of such terror could disappear so completely back into ordinary life. Marie Robinson never returned to Osset. She joined another church under a different name. Father Vincent continued his ministry but refused further exorcisms. He told a colleague that he sometimes dreamed of that night of Michael's laughter, turning into a scream, and always woke with the same thought that the ritual hadn't ended, it had only changed shape. Even now, the Taylor case divides opinion. Some see it as a tragedy of untreated psychosis and religious pressure. Others call it proof that evil, whether psychological or spiritual, can hide behind faith. What everyone agrees on is that Michael Taylor was never the same man again. The cheerful husband who once filled a house with laughter was gone, replaced by a silence that no amount of prayer could lift. And if you walk through Osset today, down the quiet residential street where the Taylors once lived, the neighbors say the house itself feels different. Ordinary at a glance, but colder somehow, as if something unseen still lingers there, waiting for a name. If the Taylor case showed how faith could twist reality, the next story unfolded in a time before explanations, before cameras, before science could chase every shadow away. In the summer of 1898, a 12-year-old boy named Wofford Moore was playing by a narrow river that wound through the woods near his family's farm. The sun was high, the air thick with the hum of insects, and the water was cool against his knees as he built a small dam from stones and branches. He had spent nearly every afternoon there that season, shaping the current, watching minnows dart through the clear shallows. It was the kind of day that felt endless. He was so focused on his little dam that he didn't notice the man approach, until a shadow stretched across the water beside him. Wofford looked up and saw a stranger standing on the opposite bank, a tall man in a dark suit, clothes far too fine for the dusty countryside. His shoes gleamed. He smiled and asked what the boy was building. "A fish trap," Wofford said, proud of his work. The man nodded, stepping closer to the edge of the stream. "That looks like a lot of effort," he said kindly. "Why not take a break? My house is just up the path. My wife's cooking supper, and we could use the company." It was a strange offer, but the man's voice was warm, almost familiar. And this was a different time. People didn't talk much about danger, and Wofford had been raised to be polite. He hesitated only a second before nodding. They walked side by side through the woods, the stranger humming softly as they went. The trail curved uphill past the bend in the river, where the trees grew denser and the light thinned. After a few minutes, Wofford saw a small clearing ahead, a cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. He had explored these woods his whole life, yet he'd never seen a house there before. On the porch sat a woman, shelling peas, 2 children playing at her feet. They waved when they saw him. A family friend from church sat beside them, chatting as though everything were perfectly ordinary. The familiarity eased his nerves. Inside the house smelled of stew and fresh bread. They ate together, and the stranger told stories about the forest, about creatures that only came out when the river was low. When dinner ended, Wofford felt his eyes grow heavy. The woman smiled and told him he could rest before walking home. He lay down near the fire, the warmth soothing him into sleep. He dreamed of drumming, steady, low, like something knocking beneath the earth. When he opened his eyes, the cabin was gone. He was lying in the middle of the forest, the sun already high again, birds calling overhead. The smell of stew and smoke had vanished. The clearing where the cabin should have been was filled with tall grass and wildflowers. His first thought was that he'd slept longer than he meant to. His second was that his family would be furious. He started down toward the river, trying to retrace his steps, but the path didn't look the same anymore. Halfway down the hill, voices called his name. Men and women emerged from the trees, faces pale with shock. They weren't just neighbors, they were a search party. "Wofford," one of them shouted. "Where have you been?" The boy blinked, confused. "At the house," he said, "the one up the hill." But when he turned to point, the hill was empty. When the search party reached him, Wofford didn't understand why everyone looked so frightened. He kept insisting he'd only been gone since yesterday afternoon. The adults exchanged uneasy glances, and finally one of the men said quietly, "Son, you've been missing for 3 days." The boy laughed at first, certain they were teasing him, but their faces stayed solemn. His father stepped forward and grabbed him by the shoulders, as if to confirm he was real. "Where have you been?" he demanded. Wofford pointed toward the trees. "At the house up there," he said. "The man took me to dinner. His wife cooked stew. There were kids there." He scanned the hill, confused. The clearing was empty, no chimney, no roof, no trail of smoke, not even a footprint. They led him back toward town. Along the way, neighbors whispered to each other about where he might have been. The woods had been searched every day since he disappeared. Men on horseback had combed the entire river bend calling his name. No one had seen a stranger, no cabin, no sign of a campfire. At home, his mother cried when she saw him. His clothes were dirty but intact, as though he'd simply gone for a long walk. He had no bruises, no scrapes, and said he hadn't eaten anything since that bowl of stew. When a doctor examined him later, he confirmed that Wofford showed no signs of dehydration, even though he should have after 3 days in the forest. When they asked him to describe the man, the boy said he wore a black suit and had a pocket watch with a silver chain. His eyes, Wofford remembered, looked strange, not wrong, just too calm, like they already knew the answers to every question. That night after the doctor left, Wofford's parents tried to press him for more details. But every time he tried to remember the path to the cabin, the memories slid away. The directions he gave contradicted themselves. He'd start describing one part of the forest, and then change it halfway through, saying, "No, maybe it was closer to the big rock, or there was an orchard, I think." He began to cry. frustrated that his mind felt foggy, like pieces of the story had been stolen. Over the next few days, word spread through the surrounding towns. People came to the Moore farmhouse to hear the boy's story firsthand. Some believed he'd been taken by travelers who later abandoned him. Others said he must have wandered off and dreamed the rest. But the searchers who had been out in the woods swore they would have found him if he'd been there all along. Then there was the sound. The night Wofford came home, several families living near the river reported hearing a faint rhythmic drumming coming from deep in the forest. It started at dusk and went on for hours, a steady beat that no one could trace. The search parties had heard it too, echoing through the trees during the last day of their hunt. When Wofford was found, the drumming stopped. People argued about that detail for years. Some said it was the echo of a nearby sawmill. Others swore the sound didn't belong to anything human. As for Wofford, he never went back to the river again. In the weeks that followed, the people of Osage County couldn't let it go. Men who had joined the search party went back to the woods with fresh supplies and clear skies, determined to find the cabin the boy had described. They mapped the river bend, combed every trail, and checked each clearing that fit his story. Nothing. No chimney stones, no foundation, no sign of cut timber. Wofford tried to lead them himself once. His father insisted he stay home, but curiosity won. The boy walked ahead of the men, pointing out landmarks. He half recognized the bent oak tree, the split boulder by the path, but each time he said, "It was right here they found only empty ground." He grew quieter the longer they searched. By afternoon he stopped talking altogether. When his father asked what was wrong, Wofford said softly, "I think it doesn't want to be found." After that, he refused to go back. Local papers picked up the story, printing it under the headline, "Boy Vanishes Returns After 3 Days Claims Visit to Phantom Cabin." Reporters called it a case of youthful imagination, though a few hinted at something stranger. The family friend Wofford said he'd seen on the porch, insisted he'd been in town the whole week, and had never met the man or his family. The contradiction turned gossip into folklore almost overnight. Farmers along the river began telling their children to stay away from the woods near the bend. Some said a family had once lived there long ago before the flood of 1872, and that the cabin's foundation sometimes showed itself when the water ran low. Others whispered that the drumming sound people heard during the search was the echo of that same family still calling for guests. By autumn, strangers from nearby towns were visiting the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost house. They found nothing, but several claimed to have heard faint knocks in the distance, slow and even, like someone chopping wood in rhythm. As for Wofford, he started waking at night, convinced he heard that same sound outside his window. His mother said he would wander into the hall, eyes half open, mumbling about a silver watch and a promise to come back after supper. When he woke, he remembered none of it. The following spring, the woods along the river flooded, sweeping away much of the undergrowth. When the water receded, a group of men found something caught in the roots of a fallen tree, a single brick, blackened by fire. The farmer who found it tossed it aside, saying it was probably from an old chimney. But when Wofford's father heard, he walked out to the river that evening and looked toward the hill where his son said the house had been. The sound of insects filled the air. He stood there for a long time listening. Nothing moved. Yet for the rest of his life he swore that every year, on the anniversary of the boy's return, he could hear a faint tapping coming from the woods, steady as a heartbeat. The year after Wofford's return, the woods along the river changed in the minds of the people who lived nearby. Before, it had been just another stretch of farmland and wild trees, a place where children played and men hunted in the fall. Afterward, it became something else, somewhere, people went quiet when they passed. The first to notice were the fishermen. They said the river near the bend no longer ran straight but seemed to slow there, its surface rippling even on still days. Nets came back tangled, and more than one man swore he heard someone walking along the bank behind him, footsteps that stopped when he turned. They blamed imagination at first. Then one fisherman found a single shoe print in the mud, small, bare, the size of a child's foot, but Wofford hadn't been near the water in months. By the second spring, the story had spread across the county. Visitors came to the river, some to test their courage, others to find proof that the cabin had ever existed. They came with sketchbooks, notebooks, and small cameras that needed long exposure to capture anything in the fading light. None of the pictures showed a house. What they did show were strange blurs along the tree-lined shapes that didn't match the branches or the light. A few of the locals still searched for the house every summer. One of them, a mill worker named John Reeves, claimed he once saw a chimney at dusk where the clearing should have been. He walked toward it, calling out to see if anyone was there, but when he blinked, the chimney was gone. All that remained was the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the trees. After that, no one went into the woods alone. Children dared each other to spend a night near the river, but none ever made it past sunset. Parents started locking doors before dark and telling stories by the fire. Some meant to scare others to remind them that the world could still hold mysteries that didn't fit inside a sermon or a science book. As for Wofford, he grew quieter each year. He avoided the river completely. When someone mentioned it, he'd smile politely and say he didn't remember much about that time. But his father noticed how Wofford would pause whenever a breeze rustled through the trees, as though listening for something only he could hear. By the time he turned 18, the drumming had returned twice, always on the same week of his disappearance. Each time, it faded as soon as someone went looking. The last time it happened, Wofford's father walked to the river alone and stayed there until morning. When he came home, he told his wife the sound wasn't coming from the trees or the ground, it was coming from beneath the water, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. After that night, the sound was never heard again. But the people of Osage County kept their distance from that stretch of forest, and long after Wofford left home, travelers still said the same thing when they passed by the river at dusk, that the air there felt too still, as if it were listening back. By the time Wofford Moore was an old man, the story of the vanished cabin had become part of the county's identity. He never spoke about it directly, but others did. Children grew up hearing that if you lingered by the river after dark, you could hear the same steady rhythm that had once followed the search party through the trees. The old folks called it the drumming forest, though no one could agree on what caused the sound. Some said it was the spirit of the man who'd invited Wofford to dinner, still waiting for a polite answer. Others believed the sound marked the place where two worlds touched like a thin spot in fabric, a crossing that only opened for the innocent. Whatever it was, no one lingered near that bend anymore. The river had swallowed part of the bank years earlier, leaving the ground soft and uneven, and people said the trees there looked wrong too, straight too, evenly spaced, like the outline of a house built by the forest itself. Occasionally, travelers passing through would hear the story from locals and laugh it off, but they'd stop smiling when they spent the night near the water and found sleep impossible. A few claimed to wake just before dawn to the sound of slow knocking somewhere beyond the fog, each beat followed by a pause long enough to make their skin crawl. They'd pack up and leave before breakfast, refusing to talk about it afterward. For Wofford, the drumming became less a sound and more a memory that lived behind his thoughts. Some nights, while lying in bed, he'd picture the clearing exactly as he remembered it, the cabin lit by firelight, the smell of bread, the low hum of a man's voice telling stories about the river. He could still see the silver chain of the watch glinting in the firelight. He could still hear the man saying, "It's just up the bend." Once, when Wofford's grandson asked why he never went fishing near the old river path, he only said, "Because that's where time forgets itself." After he died, his family went through his things and found a small wooden carving inside his nightstand. It was rough, unfinished, shaped like a cabin with no door. On the back, etched faintly with a pocket knife, were the words, "I promised I'd come back." The carving became a curiosity in town, passed from one generation to another. It eventually ended up in the small local museum, where it sits in a glass case labeled "Artifact from the Wofford Moor Disappearance 1898. Visitors still ask the guide whether the story is true. The guide always gives the same answer, "True enough to stay." And sometimes when the museum closes for the night and the hall grows quiet, the staff swear they hear a faint rhythm echoing through the building, 3 slow knocks followed by silence. Every generation leaves behind a story it can't quite explain. In Osage County, that story was Wofford Moore's. Long after his death, the river changed course, and the forest grew thicker, swallowing what was left of the paths people once walked. But the legend stayed. Hunters still avoided that stretch of trees, saying the air grew colder there, and the silence felt heavy, like a held breath. The drumming stopped decades ago, but the fear never really left. It lived in the pauses between sounds, in the way people hesitated when the woods went quiet. When children asked what had really happened to the boy by the river, the older folks never gave a straight answer. They'd just say, "He went where he was invited," and that was the end of it. Over time, the story became less about a boy and more about a lesson, how curiosity could blur the line between the safe world and whatever waits just past it. The cabin became a symbol of that threshold. Some said it stood for temptation, others for the past itself, waiting to pull you back when you looked too closely. The truth was simpler. No one ever found proof that the cabin existed. No one proved it didn't. It lived in that narrow space, where memory and imagination overlap the same place. All unsolved stories live, when the world stops trying to explain them. A century later, when documentaries and podcasts rediscovered the tale, researchers called it one of the earliest vanishing time accounts on record. Paranormal groups camped near the river. They brought equipment, night vision sensors that could measure tremors or magnetic changes in the ground. None of them recorded a thing. But every group without fail reported the same strange experience. At some point in the night, the forest grew so quiet they could hear their own hearts beating, and one of them would whisper, "Do you hear that?" Then nothing. Folklore fades, but its shape remains. The people who once believed in ghosts now believe in pattern psychology, trauma science. Yet the feeling those stories leave behind doesn't change. It's the echo that matters, the pause that makes you listen harder. And for some people, that pause isn't just silence, it's a doorway. Because sometimes what we call legend is just the world, reminding us how little we understand it and how easily the unknown finds new ways to speak. Every century has its own kind of superstition. The old stories lived in forests and rivers. The new ones hide in cities, whispered about in office elevators and late-night phone calls. In 1999, one such story began in Seattle with a man named Christopher Case and ended exactly 7 days later, just as the woman who cursed him had promised. Christopher was 35, fit, successful, and meticulous about everything from his diet to his vinyl collection. He worked as a music executive, the kind of man whose life looked enviably ordinary from the outside. Friends said he lived alone by choice, preferring quiet nights filled with the sound of obscure recordings from ancient civilizations. His fascination with early Egyptian music wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. He'd tell people that the rhythms felt older than language, like they were speaking directly to something buried in human memory. In early April of that year, Chris flew to San Francisco for a business meeting. He met with a small group of clients, one of whom brought a guest, an older woman, striking confident with eyes that seemed to linger too long. She was charming at first, engaging him in a conversation about his passion for ancient music. When she mentioned that she was a practitioner of old rituals, Chris laughed politely, assuming it was a joke. Over dinner, the woman's attention never left him. She talked about Egypt, about melodies that could summon memories from past lives, and about how sound could open doors between worlds. When she leaned forward and said she could teach him what the ancients really heard, Chris smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. He thought she was eccentric, maybe lonely. When the meal ended, she stood up and asked him to come back to her place to listen to music she said he would never forget. Her tone was playful, but her eyes weren't. Chris declined politely. She insisted again, smiling wider this time, and when he shook his head, something in her expression changed. The warmth vanished. She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You've made a mistake. I'm a witch, and within a week you'll be dead." The table fell silent. Someone laughed nervously, thinking she was still joking, but Chris just sat there, unsure how to respond. The woman left first, walking out without another word. The rest of the group awkwardly changed the subject, and by the end of the night, everyone had convinced themselves it was just a bizarre misunderstanding. Chris flew home to Seattle the next morning. He told the story to a friend on the phone, laughing it off, but admitting the woman's intensity had unsettled him. It became a joke between them. 7 days, huh? Better make them count. For 48 hours, everything stayed normal. Chris worked, exercised, went out for coffee, and even joked about the curse. Then, late on the third night, something changed. He called the same friend again, this time his voice shaking. "I keep hearing whispering in my apartment," he said. "I think someone's in here." It was the beginning of the week that would end his life. By the third night, Christopher Case stopped laughing about the curse. He hadn't slept. The noises had started softly, barely audible whispers he thought came from the vents. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate moving from one end of his apartment to the other. Each time he got up to check, the sound stopped. At first, he assumed exhaustion was playing tricks on him. He'd been working long hours, living on caffeine and protein bars. He told himself the whispering was air pressure, the footsteps the neighbors upstairs. But his apartment was on the top floor. By morning, his nerves were frayed. He left for work early and stayed late, dreading the thought of going home. His coworkers noticed his exhaustion. When one asked if he was okay, he smiled thinly and said, "Just bad dreams." That night, he double-checked the locks, closed every blind, and turned on the television for background noise. He kept the lights on. For a while the noise helped, until he realized the whispering was still there, threading beneath the hum of the TV, faint but constant. He turned the volume up. The whispers grew louder to match it, as though they were moving closer. Chris tried to locate the source. He opened every closet, checked behind furniture, even pulled open the air vents. Nothing. Yet whenever he stood still, the whispers resumed words he couldn't understand, a low rhythmic murmur that seemed to circle him. By midnight, the sound shifted into something worse, breathing. He'd feel it close to his ear, followed by a faint exhale that chilled the back of his neck. He spun around more than once, expecting to see someone standing behind him. The room was always empty. At 2 a.m., He left the apartment and drove aimlessly through the city. The streets were empty except for the occasional taxi and the distant hum of traffic. When he returned home near dawn, his answering machine light was blinking. The message was from the same friend he'd told about the curse. "Hey man, just checking in," the voice said cheerfully. "Hope you're still alive." Chris deleted it without listening to the rest. The next day, he bought several candles and a small crucifix from a thrift store. He wasn't religious, but the symbolism comforted him. That night, he placed them on his kitchen counter and sat nearby, determined to stay awake. Around 3 a.m., every candle went out at once. The apartment plunged into silence so thick it felt like a physical pressure on his chest. He tried to relight the candles, but the matches wouldn't catch. His hands were shaking. That's when he saw the movement, something dark, crossing the hallway toward his bedroom. It was quick, barely more than a shift in the shadows, but it had form and purpose. He froze, listening. The air grew cold, and a whisper drifted from the darkness, clear this time, close enough to understand. 7 days. Over the next few days, Christopher Case became a man living between two worlds, the visible one everyone else occupied, and the invisible one that seemed to close in on him each night. His co-workers said he looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, but still polite. When they asked if he was sick, he said he was just fighting off something strange he couldn't shake. He stopped sleeping altogether. He bought more candles, more crucifixes, and boxes of salt that he poured in thin lines across his windowsills and door frames. He left lights on in every room, and the television running at full volume. When friends called, he didn't pick up. One of them, a woman named Sammy, finally reached him on the 5th day. She said his voice sounded far away, as if he were speaking through static. He told her the whispering had turned into voices, now distinct, layered, some male, some female, all mocking. He said they laughed when he prayed, laughed when he tried to play music, laughed when he covered his ears. Sammy told him to see a doctor. He said he couldn't. "They won't understand," he whispered. "They'll think I'm crazy. But it's real. I feel them touching me." She tried to get him to leave his apartment and stay with her, but he refused. "It's safer if I stay here," he said. "They can't follow me if I keep the lights on." That night he placed candles on every surface and played Gregorian chants through his speakers, looping them on repeat. The music filled the apartment like a fortress. But as the hours passed, the chanting began to distort, soft at first, then layered with sounds that didn't belong. He heard footsteps pacing behind the melody and the faint hum of voices whispering his name. He wrote notes on scraps of paper, leaving them on his kitchen counter and bedside table, reminders of what to do if the power went out. "Keep praying, don't turn off the lights, stay awake." Neighbors later said they could hear the chanting through the walls all night. Around dawn, one of them heard Chris's voice shouting a single desperate cry that cut off suddenly. When Sammy called the next morning, he answered in a whisper. "They're angry," he said. "They don't want me to fight back." His breathing was uneven, his voice trembling. "I don't have much time left." He hung up before she could respond. By the 6th day, his messages became shorter and stranger. He left one voicemail saying he'd been forgiven, another saying he'd seen something standing in the corner of the ceiling. His handwriting on the notes scattered around the apartment grew shakier, letters slanting upward as if written by a trembling hand. On the 7th day, he didn't come to work. He didn't answer his phone, and when Sammy drove to his apartment that evening, she found the lights still on, the chanting still looping through the speakers, and the door locked from the inside. When Sammy arrived at Christopher's apartment on the evening of April 17th, the lights were still burning in every window. The blinds were drawn and faint music echoed through the glass, low continuous chanting looping without pause. She knocked 3 times, then called his name. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. She went to the building manager, who opened the door with a spare key. The moment they stepped inside, the music hit them like a wall, ancient voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. The air smelled faintly of wax and metal. Every light in the apartment was on. Candles had been placed along the counters and windowsills, some burned down to the wick. Lines of salt marked the door frames. Dozens of small crucifixes were propped against walls and shelves, each one turned slightly askew as if they'd been disturbed. On the floor near the kitchen table, notes were scattered, some written in his neat hand, others scribbled in frantic strokes. The last one read, "Forgive me, I can't fight them anymore." They found Christopher in the bathtub. The water was still clear. He was fully dressed, hands folded neatly over his chest, eyes closed as though asleep. The coroner would later rule it a sudden heart failure, though his medical records showed no prior issues. There were no signs of struggle, no medication, no alcohol. The time of death was estimated at early morning, exactly 7 days after his encounter in San Francisco. The apartment itself became the focus of speculation. Investigators noted that the stereo system was still running, but the power to the rest of the building had briefly cut out around the estimated time of death. The circuit breaker had reset itself, and when maintenance checked it later, they found no faults. Sammy told police about the phone calls, the whispers, the fear that had consumed him. They listened politely, but didn't include those details in the official report. To them, it was an isolated tragedy, a stressed man overcome by anxiety and exhaustion. To her, it was something else entirely. The following week, she went back to collect his belongings. The salt had hardened into white crusts on the floor, and the air felt still like a place holding its breath. When she reached the stereo to shut it off, the speakers let out a soft, low hum. One final note, steady and deep, before the room went silent. She turned off the light and stood there for a moment, staring at the reflection of the empty hallway in the window. For a second, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. When she turned, there was nothing but the faint outline of salt and the glow of candle wax cooling on the counter. Later that year, she told a journalist that she didn't believe in curses. But she said quietly, if it wasn't a curse, then it was something that knew exactly how to act like one. In the weeks following Christopher Case's death, Seattle police reached out to contacts in San Francisco to identify the woman he dined with. No one ever found her. The restaurant staff remembered the group but couldn't describe her clearly. One waiter said she seemed older than the rest, somewhere between 50 and timeless. Another thought she might have given a false name. When investigators checked the phone numbers from the dinner party, none matched hers. It was as though she had appeared for one night and vanished. Sammy stayed in touch with the detectives handling the case. They told her privately that the official explanation would remain simple, natural causes brought on by extreme stress. But off the record, one of them admitted the apartment didn't feel right. "I've been in places where bad things happened," he said. This was different, like it was still waiting for him to come back. The story spread quickly, first through coworkers, then through friends of friends, until it reached the local news. By the time national outlets picked it up, the details had already changed. Some said the witch had followed him home. Others claimed he'd been found surrounded by occult symbols drawn on the walls. None of that was true, but accuracy mattered less than the atmosphere of the story. The idea that a man could be cursed to death in an age that no longer believed in curses. Within a few months, the internet gave the case a new life. Message boards traded theories, undiagnosed heart condition, stress-induced psychosis, or supernatural retribution. One user claimed to have tracked down another man who'd met the same woman years earlier and described her in identical detail: dark hair, silver jewelry, eyes that never blinked while she spoke. The man refused to go on record. In the years since Paranormal, researchers have revisited the case countless times. Some focus on the coincidence of the timeline, others on the symbolism of the objects found in his apartment. A few point to the fact that the chanting on his stereo was traced to a recording of early Christian exorcism hymns, music meant to ward off evil. It played for hours after his death, looping on its own. Sammy never fully recovered from what she saw that night. She moved away from Seattle and refused all interviews, except one a decade later. In it, she described her last conversation with Chris, the whisper in his voice, the sound of chanting in the background, and his final words: "They're here, but they can't touch me if I keep the light on." When the interviewer asked what she believed happened, she paused for a long time before answering. "I think something old found him," she said. "Something that knew how to use fear like a language." To this day, the story of Christopher Case is filed in police records under unexplained death. But in every retelling, the ending remains the same, a promise kept exactly as it was spoken. Every story tonight has shared a single heartbeat, the quiet moment before something ordinary becomes impossible. A man who captured a figure no one else could see. A couple who discovered that home isn't always safe. A husband whose faith turned into madness. A boy who followed kindness into a place that shouldn't exist. And a man who learned that fear can kill long before the body gives up. Different decades, different faces, but the same shadow threaded through them all, the one that hides inside trust, belief, and curiosity. That's what makes these stories linger. They remind us that the line between explanation and mystery isn't drawn by proof, it's drawn by comfort. And when comfort disappears, we're left with what's always been there, the unknown staring back. Maybe that's why we tell these stories again and again. We want to believe we can understand the things that terrify us, that we can close the doors, lock the windows, or pray hard enough to keep the darkness outside. But sometimes it isn't outside at all. It's waiting in the silence between sounds, in the reflection that moves when you don't, in the questions that still don't have answers. So if you've stayed with me through all of them, from the silent ship to the quiet apartment, from the church in Osset to the forest in Osage, and finally to that candlelit room in Seattle, thank you. These are the places where truth and fear meet halfway. And wherever you are right now, remember, the things we can't explain aren't always waiting far away. Sometimes they're already here, just patient enough to be noticed. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening all the way to the end. If you haven't already, please subscribe, drop a comment letting me know your thoughts, and most importantly, take care of each other out there. There's always another story waiting in the darkness. Leave a light on tonight.